Making this video to talk about the Panasonic Lumix GH5 and how to get better dynamic range out of it with settings. You can see my editor here is Final Cut Pro 10 version 10.4, which is the newest version as of late December 2017. Just came out a couple weeks ago and has some excellent features. So if you're a Mac user, please be sure to check that out. If you're a Mac user and a Premiere user, well, you should still check it out because it gives you a lot that the previous version didn't have. Also built-in ability to handle LUTs, and it's a lot faster than Premiere as well. So something to consider. I am looking at HLG especially. These are color profiles. If you take a look at the manual for the GH5, they're called photo styles. Standard, vivid, natural, all the way down to CineD, CineV, like 709, and Vlog. I don't have Vlog. Vlog would be nice to have to put in this video, but I don't want to pay the $100. At least, I've read a lot, I've seen a lot done by professional people who swear by Vlog, and I've seen some pretty impressive looking footage from it. But going to a camera store doesn't ensure that I can test it. Even if you find a camera that has Vlog in it at a camera store, you cannot test that camera in a variety of situations that you would need to test it in to determine if you really need Vlog or not. So because I don't know if I'd really like it or not, and since there's no means for me to try before I buy, I haven't put my money down to buy it. But instead, in order to get the most dynamic range out of my GH5, I've been using CineD. CineD does a pretty good job. And so today I just did a basic test. It's handheld using the Panasonic 20mm f1.7 lens. The Embody Stabilization of the GH5 is quite good. And I also use the stabilizer lock feature to make it even better. And my focus point was on this little branch of the coat holder here underneath the hat. And so every clip that I made was properly focused onto this point. So if I go to my first test here and have a look, we can see that I have CineD. This is color graded with no exposure compensation. And on the left, we see it goes from 0 to 100 almost perfectly. Green and blue are only slightly above, but it's okay to let them clip off a little bit. This is Rec 709. What is that? If you're not familiar with it, it's basically the color space that you will need when you upload your videos to YouTube, okay? Or display them on your screen. This is the typical color space here, the standard default color space of Final Cut Pro and many other editors. There are other color spaces. High dynamic range is Rec 2020, and that gives you above 100. You can go up to 120 here, and you're not going to lose information. But you need an HDR display or a display that can display Rec 2020, which most TVs and displays cannot. So when you're going to YouTube, you need to shrink down your information into the 0 to 100 Rec 709 color space. Okay, so let's take a look at this scene. I have everything set up so that my edits are applied. I've color graded it. There's no exposure compensation, and there's no LUT applied. If I take off my grading, it looks like this. So out of the camera, bringing it in to Final Cut Pro is going to look like this, and we can see that the room is fairly dark. The windows, it's not completely exposed for the windows. Actually, the exposure centers on this center area here, so that the darks really aren't too dark, the brights really aren't too bright. But look what happened. You lose information in this area. And so if I zoom in at 300% to those areas, we can see that the information is lost here. No matter how you color grade it, I'll apply that now. See, that's my color grading built in. You're never going to get this information back. It wasn't recorded. It's recorded as pure white. So that is completely gone. But the colorizing, the color modifications I made here make the interior room look better. So that is CineD D. Now keep in mind, CineD D gives me more dynamic range than the other profiles. Now I'll show you some comparisons with the other profiles, such as standard, like 709, and so on, in a few minutes here. But I just want to let you know that I get more dynamic range with this profile than the other profiles, except for Vlog. Vlog will give me yet another stop of dynamic range, but I don't have that to compare with, so I can't comment on that. Let's take a look at HLG, which is HDR, high dynamic range. Now, if I take off my color grading, we can see here that I also need to remove a LUT because I have a LUT applied. Out of the camera, it's going to look like this. It looks a mess. It looks like I've lost all of this information. And we can see here what's above 100 is quite a lot of information here, right? But again, we need to export to YouTube. We need to use this on TVs that everybody has. So that's going to be Rec 709, and that's going to clip everything above 100. So that's why these highlights are clipping here. Well, online, you can find a free LUT that converts, authored by Nick Driftwood here. You can see the address. I'll put a link to the description down in the description under this video for you. It has a Dropbox download link that you can get. It comes with a variety of LUTs, but the one that interests me is the LUT that converts 2020 to 709, and that's what I have here. So if we apply that LUT with no grading, just the LUT only, this is how it comes out. Okay, so it brought down the highlights that were clipped before to within the 0 to 100 range of Rec 709, and we can see the benefits here. But the room is too dark, so if I had more lights on in the room, that would actually be the best thing to do, but I didn't have that, so we need to color grade it. And once we color grade it, we can see that the room exposure looks quite good, and I haven't lost anything in the highlights. Now keep in mind, I'm going to flip back now to CineD D. There's no exposure compensation. Now when I shot this video, I had my zebras enabled, and I could see that the zebras were here, and I could see that, okay, this is going to get blown out. But just for the sake of making this video, I did not turn on any exposure compensation. But I didn't do that for HLG either, and take a look. CineD D, HLG. Now the room, in terms of the room brightness, it looks the same between the clips, right? There's a minor change in the color, but don't worry about that. Just take a look at the highlights and shadows. The room is the same, but the highlights are different. Aha! That's where the advantage of HLG comes in. And if we come here, we can see the details in the curtains. If we jump to CineD D, those details are gone forever, and you're never going to get those back. HLG, CineD D, HLG. Why is this important? Because there are times when you're not going to remember to use exposure compensation or have the ability to use exposure compensation. Maybe you're in the middle of videoing something and you're on a tripod, and to dial in exposure compensation would mean to touch a button, and you might record that on your microphone. You know, there are reasons why you may not be able to dial in exposure compensation. But with HLG, I'm not saying in every situation you won't need it, but as you can see here, I mean, this is pretty darn bright, and compared to the interior illumination, and yet it preserved most of these details of the noonday sun. Okay. I also, if you want to look at the clips here, I've got sharpening applied. Some people say, well, don't use the regular sharpening, use unsharp mask. And so I was able to find, using this alex4d.com website, unsharp mask A4D. It's free. You get a bunch of other plugins too for Final Cut Pro 10. And I brought those in and manually installed those. And that is the unsharp mask. You can see here, A4D. I've got a very conservative setting of 2.0. It's only 50% applied. You can go all the way up to 2.0, but I have it set at 1.0 without and with in order to really see it, you need to zoom in, so I'll go ahead and do that now on this hat. Without, it's a little bit fuzzy in my opinion. Some people like this, I don't. And that's with it dialed in. Now this threshold here, I don't know what it's for. I mean, some people say, well, it's for this. Well, look, once you apply even a little bit, it's like, what did it do? Right, so I usually leave this off because it just doesn't, it kills unsharp mask basically, even if you dial in a little bit. So I was hoping, maybe able to use the threshold to get, to avoid sharpening some of the noise, but it just doesn't work for me. And so that's unsharp mask. Now later in this video I will compare unsharp mask to Final Cut Pro's standard sharpening, and you can see the difference between the two. But basically in these two clips I'm using unsharp mask with both of the settings that you see here. Also the color curves that I have set up, it's just a little curve here to boost the midtones. Without it, it's a little bit darker, right? It's not affecting the highlights here. I guess some people would say it's more natural, but I wanted it brighter because my eye, the human eye, can see even greater than Rec 2020 color space. And to my eye, when I was actually looking at the scene with my eyes, this is more along the lines of what I saw in terms of how bright the room was in comparison with the outside. Whereas this, maybe some people might say, looks more filmic. You need to dial down the saturation a bit without it. But, you need to color grade in accordance with what looks good to you. But to me, I prefer this look myself. So that's how the curves look. So that was my first test. Okay. I also did a second test, and that's where the other profiles come in, so we can compare them. Now when I did my second test, this time I obeyed the zebras. On the parts that were bright, I used a -1 exposure compensation. Okay, now you can see the time on the clock. It was a little bit later in the day, but not too much later, just a bit after noon, and the sun was a tad bit brighter than 11 o'clock in the morning, but nevertheless the exposure compensation helped to keep the highlights from blowing out in this area, and you can see that here. Now this is color graded. I used color grading settings. I copied and pasted those, but then I hand tweaked them because every profile needed some minor modifications. But basically the same settings are applied from clip to clip. And without any of the modifications, there is no LUT applied here. So this is how it looks coming from the camera. And to make sure the room looks fairly decent, this is how it looks color graded. Here is CineD D. And I told you before that I would compare with the built-in sharpening. You can see here this has unsharp mask applied, no sharpening applied. And by the way, when I shot this clip in CineD, I had sharpening dialed down to -5. Okay, so sharpening all the way off. Also the noise reduction, I also had that down to -5 as well. I also had contrast dialed down to -3, and I left saturation at the default. So if we say Final Cut Pro sharpening, it's normally 2.5. I boosted it a little bit to 2.72. You can see with and without, with and without, with and without. And unsharp mask. So unsharp mask, I would say it sharpens the noise a little bit more, but it sharpens everything else a little bit more too. Notice the hat. It's a little bit less sharpened with this built-in Final Cut Pro sharpening. Which looks better? Well, that's up to you. Some people might say this looks better without it at all because it doesn't sharpen the noise, but it looks fuzzy to me, and I don't really like that. I like a sharper image. And the unsharp mask, it does that. Now also notice I'm using 2.0 here on the amount. If I were to dial that down to 1.0, this is about what you'd get. And then compare that with this. So it really is all in what you think looks good. To me, that looks a little bit fuzzy, and this looks a bit better. Again, -1, exposure compensation. Take a note here. I'm going to jump back to like 709. Notice that the building here, this is another house over here, it looks brighter, right? And also the details, these little flowery details in the curtains here, you see less of those. In CineD, you see the building is darker, you see more of the details in the curtains, which comes as no surprise because CineD gives you a greater dynamic range. Now if we take a look at the standard profile, looks very much like 709. In terms of the brightness and the details that we have in the highlights. Yes, the color, my color grading is a little bit different. The grittiness of the darker areas, that's a little bit different. Each profile is, has its own unique flavor to it. But CineD gives you more details in the highlights. Next, we have CineD V. And you might say, well, CineD V should be like CineD, but actually it's not. It doesn't give you quite the same dynamic range, at least not in my testing. You can see it. Keep your eyes locked on this area as I jump back. Looks the same. Looks the same. Now go to CineD. So we get more details here. So among these 4 profiles, CineD, in my opinion, is giving us more details in the highlights with -1 exposure compensation dialed in. Now let's take a look at HLG. HLG, this is my second test HLG, has no exposure compensation dialed in. Okay, just like before, it has the LUT applied, which converts Rec 2020 down to Rec 709. And I have all of my color adjustments here. So if I were to take off the LUT, that's how it's going to look. Not graded, no LUT applied. The highlights look completely blown out, and for this reason, there are all of this data above 100. So we're going to dial in the LUT, which makes the room too dark. Then we need to color grade the room, and there we go. So if we jump between CineD and HLG, pretty much what you see over here on the right is where your eyes should be focused mainly, because the room looks largely the same. You're going to see, well, hey, it looks pretty much the same. Minor variations in color, just ignore that, okay? The highlights, the details, the preservation of them, that's what we're looking at here, and it looks pretty much the same. But why? Exposure compensation of -1. Remember in my first test, I didn't use that at all, and the highlights got blown out. And there are times when you either cannot or don't want to dial in the exposure compensation, right, for CineD. And in that case, these highlights would have been blown out. But with HLG, I didn't have to worry about it, and the highlights were preserved. And therein lies the benefit of HLG. You really don't have to worry as much. Now, you cannot apply an in-camera LUT with HLG like you can with Vlog. All right? But there are compensation settings in the GH5 that let you properly expose the scene for HLG. And there's 2 different settings you can choose from. So by and large, you are able to properly expose the scene for HLG if you decide to shoot in HLG. And all of this footage that you're seeing in this video is 1080p, 60 frames per second, 10-bit. Okay? So in both my first test and in the second test here, HLG and all of the profiles, they're all the same. 1080p, 10-bit, 60 frames per second. Okay? So on the whole, I would say that I may decide to move from use of CineD to HLG for the reason that it preserves the highlights from getting blown out. And I've shot, recently I shot more than 1 hour of an onstage performance where the highlights got blown out and people wearing white shirts due to a spotlight, the bright lighting. And yes, you could say, well, it's just your camera settings and so on and so on and so on. But nevertheless, had I used exposure compensation, I could have accounted for that. But there are reasons I didn't use it. Actually, I didn't think to use it. Whereas if I had shot it in HLG, I could have avoided that problem completely because it would have preserved more of the details in the highlights. Now, in terms of noise, well, you could see what I saw. If we zoom in again to the hat area, all right, this is HLG, this is CineD, HLG, CineD. Now notice this time, we've got less noise, actually more noise in CineD. It seems to be color noise here. Even in the hat area, you can see the color noise. And in HLG, you don't really see that. It seems overall like less noise. Whereas in my first test, there was a bit more noise in HLG than there was in CineD. But in the second test, remember I'm using exposure compensation. I brought it down one stop. So I had to bring up the darks more, and so more noise has appeared in them. So overall, I hope this video has helped you make a decision on whether you're going to at least test out HLG. It's not specifically, it is specifically made for viewing on high dynamic range monitors, but most of us don't have that. Most of us want to just, I mean, I don't want to say most, but some of you out there do professional work. I'm not doing that. A lot of people out there want to upload to YouTube, and we want to upload the best videos we can. And what I've shown here is that to preserve the dynamic range, especially your highlights, there is merit to going with HLG. However, if you prefer CineD, so long as you use exposure compensation, you can get very comparable results. In terms of how well Vlog would do, I would assume it's going to do a bit better than CineD, perhaps more along the lines of HLG, such that you wouldn't really need to use exposure compensation to keep your highlights from getting blown out. But again, it's going to cost you $100 to find out whether that's true or not. And I've also read some reports from people saying that there's a lot of noise in the shadowy areas whenever you color grade Vlog. I don't know if it compares with the amount of noise you saw in this video to HLG, but again, I don't want to pay the $100 to find that out. Maybe some of you will. Some of you may have comments or suggestions. Please feel free to put those comments down below this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this helpful.